Yeah, last section of the day and a half. Is what? Okay, so we get.
Hi everyone, my name is Kondirolli. Today I'm presenting new experiment that we conducted in India. This was the first time we're presenting it, so I will take any comments and feedback that we have. This is joint work with Saudi India, who's in the audience, and Steve Mason, Power LSE. So this is a project on waste management. Waste management is recognized as one of the bigger issues of our time, even with the UN Global 9/11. It makes it to making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Waste production globally has increased by tenfold in the past century, and it's expected to increase by another 70% by 2050. Worldwide, regardless of income level of countries, but is expected to rise at a higher income rate within low and middle income countries. Worldwide, half of waste is still mismanaged, but rates vary by income level and region. In South Asia, for example, 85% of waste is mismanaged. This is associated with a number of problems. One is environmental degradation, such as groundwater pollution from dumping of waste, or clogging of rivers and oceans, which then causes flooding in cities, which we have seen in the news. This is also associated with greenhouse gas emissions. So, for example, a fifth of global methane emissions, which account for half of degrees Celsius of global warming, since the great industrial era is associated with waste mismanagement. And also for outcomes such as living near landfills has been shown to be associated with problems such as adverse pregnancy outcomes, different types of cancers, chronic respiratory problems, stroke, and diabetes. So waste generation is increasing, and also waste composition is changing. Waste generation, for example, in South Asia is projected to double. But also waste composition is changing and becoming more complex as a rise in plastic use and electronic products makes waste management just more complex and better. 40% of waste worldwide is still disposed in landfills, so that is both in developing and developed countries. But in developing countries, landfills are poorly managed, which causes environmental and health issues such as the one I mentioned earlier. So in developed countries, incineration plants are a viable solution, but this is less adequate solution in developing countries because the waste composition in developing countries is different, and most of the waste is actually organic, which has a low calorific value and is not the right type of waste that ends up in incineration plants. Regardless of waste composition and how waste is managed in different countries, segregation of waste at source reduces the amount of waste that needs to be landfilled or incinerated, and overall it improves the efficiency of waste management system and processes. One way to think about it is to segregate the waste into recyclable waste such as paper and plastic, and biodegradable waste, so this is waste that can be composted and brought back into the nature. Segregation at source therefore reduces the waste that goes into landfills and incinerators, and has been a key in waste management systems in all countries. For example, the EU Landfill Directive or the Global Methane Initiative focus on banning organic waste from going into landfills as a key of reducing global methane emissions worldwide. 70% of developing countries have management policies. This is also because municipal waste, even though it's a small share of total waste that is generated, it makes up a very large share of municipal budgets. For example, in low-income countries, around 20% of municipal budgets goes on municipal waste management, which is a much higher share than in high-income countries, which is around 4%. There are a number of challenges with overall waste management or local segregation at source, such as low recycling rate, funding constraints, and waste mismanagement overall that causes environmental and health problems to the residents, but also to the waste workers who are involved in the process. Overall, the public participation in waste segregation is therefore a key for a functional waste management system, but in segregation and enforcement is challenging. And overall, for our purposes, that there's very limited data studies on what is effective waste management in developing countries. This map comes from a report by the World Bank, which looked at different disposal methods by income level of countries. So, for example, if you look at high-income countries, 40% of the waste goes into landfills, but only 2%, according to their estimates, is openly dumped. And then there's around 30% of waste that is actually recycled. As you move to upper middle income countries, lower middle countries, and low income countries, the share of the waste that is openly dumped increases a lot. So, for example, an estimate of 93% of waste in low income countries is dumped, and only 3% of waste is landfilled, with the remaining being recycled, composted, or incinerated. This just shows that there's a very different way of managing waste based on income levels, and the share of recyclable waste or any sort of proper management of waste in low countries is very low. I'm going to talk a bit about the context of our study. So this study examines the potential of segregation and recycling as source in improving waste management in India, developing country setting. A bit about waste management, waste generation and management in India. The daily waste generation per capita in India is about 0.5 kilogram, which is very typical of low and middle income countries, but is expected to increase as the population is projected to increase, and also the income as well. Most of the waste in India is collected, but a third of it is not managed properly. Methane emissions make up a third of total emissions in the country, which is more than a double of the global average of 15%. This has been shown to be associated with landfills and overall waste mismanagement. And actually, a quarter of all global methane emissions that come from landfills come from India. This is also very costly for municipalities, as Indian municipalities spend 10 to 50% of their budget on solid waste management. And as of 2016, there is a mandate that requires collection of segregated waste, but segregation rates and community awareness about it remains very low. Our study is in Patna, which is the capital city of Bihar, a state in the north of India and one of the lowest income states in India. Patna has a very high urbanization rate. About 40% of its 5 million people live in urban areas, and it has a high population growth and also high levels of waste pollution. In Patna, similar to other cities, there is a door-to-door collection of waste that is provided by the municipal government through waste trucks. So there are 11 unique waste trucks in the intervention area for our experiment. The way that the waste collection works is that the truck goes throughout the designated route and stops at designated stops, and then the residents walk and throw out the waste in the truck. The actual truck has 2 separate compartments for biodegradable and non-biodegradable waste, so it already has some infrastructure of recycling in place. The truck then takes the waste to a collection point, and that waste is then disposed of in a landfill outside the city. So we were given a map of the truck routes and also the buildings and the number of households that live in these buildings, but the data was quite outdated. First, the latest census data in India is from 2011, and also the maps were outdated in terms of the number of buildings that have been built with high urbanization rate. So prior to intervention, we did our own census of buildings and households, as well as the mapping of all routes, the truck routes, to ensure that we cover all roads and all the things in the intervention and control areas. So the intervention is staggered over time for the residents on municipal waste truck routes. We form a cluster of 100 contiguous buildings within each truck route to can be assigned a number sequentially on the map. So we go from west to east and down north to south. We then select these odd numbered clusters for intervention and then assign a random number for how they will be intervened in terms of time. So the intervention was rolled out in a staggered design, such as every 3 days a randomly chosen cluster received it. Odd numbered clusters were covered first. We start the intervention on the 16th of December 2021, and the last group was covered in February 2022. And then for fairness purposes, we also deliver the intervention to all the other odd even groups, and that's between the 9th of February of April 2022 when the intervention ends. I'm going to give you some details on the actual intervention. So this was training on the principles of waste management that was delivered to the households. First, we gave information on the public health and environmental impacts of waste management, including more information on how waste is managed in the city of Patna. And then there were sessions on waste management principles and practices where households were demonstrated and trained on how to reduce the amount of waste, how to segregate it, how to recycle it, and how to compost it. Each household were then given a number that they could call if they needed help with setting up compost kits or segregation bins or any other questions that they might have about the waste segregation of source. Overall, this was designed to provide the basic knowledge and skills that would be needed to correctly take waste management at source. These are two of the pamphlets that were also delivered. These are in Hindi, but on the left side, it just shows the type of waste that can be composted and type of waste that can be segregated. And on the right hand side, it kind of shows about composting and how it works, some of the benefits of it. And there's the landfill development. So for the purposes of evaluating the intervention, we collected observational data on waste that is thrown by the households. So twice a week, observation data on the waste being disposed on trucks in all routes were collected. The enumerators went inside the trucks with the truck drivers and received the waste that was being disposed from the households. And they reported the type of waste and also the weight of wet, dry, and mixed waste that was disposed on that day. First, we did an initial observation data collection in all truck routes 2 weeks before the intervention. And then within the start of the intervention, we collected this observational data for 6 months with an additional set of data collected 4 months after the intervention ended to see longer term effects.
You see something on the spatial scale here, and in particular, is it sort of plausible or realistic that they could either just go to a different truck stop where they didn't, it's not going to be captured, or they just dispose of it in other ways? So should we think of these households where they're all they're disposing of all of their waste on these trucks, or they substitute to doing, I don't know, composting at home, or whatever? What's the counterfactual here?
Yeah, so the counterfactual would be that they would either compost or just openly dump it. So, and about the question whether
But are you measuring that?
Well, we're measuring the waste that comes into the truck and whether it's recyclable or not.
But if they're not doing that, surely composting would be preferable. Composting would be preferable, whereas open dumping would be
yes,
much worse.
Yeah, so that's something that we can then measure later to see, for example, the volume of waste is decreasing over time. That would be an indication that maybe they're either composting it or openly dumping it. And I'll get.
Okay, so you measure at the house, but sorry, it's not very clear. But so you're measuring at the truck stops, but you're not measuring what the households are doing.
No, so when the arrangements receive the waste, they also know which building it's coming from and also the number of households that live in that building. So we have the volume of the waste and also where it's coming from and how many households are throwing that particular waste. And in terms of if they're going somewhere else to throw it, I think that would be the under the system they have to walk. So they would choose to walk to the nearest
So every household always goes to the same truck, so there's one that's nearby.
Yeah, so because the truck goes throughout the route and it stops in designated areas, so you would choose those. Okay, so just a recap of the intervention timeline, we allocated the area of intervention and we got the permission and from the government. We mapped the waste truck routes and do the census of buildings and households for each of these truck routes. We do initial observation of waste disposal. We create the clusters of buildings, which is our unit of treatment. We number the clusters of each route and choose randomly how the clusters will receive the intervention. We do an observation of waste disposal on all routes, intervention for first clusters, which I declared that were odd number clusters on first route, intervention for first half of clusters on all the other routes. And then after the intervention ends, then we deliver the intervention for the rest of the clusters. Fairness purposes, we do observation of waste data during all this time, and then also after 4 months to look at the long-term effects. So the start of the intervention for households on each route is staggered over the period of the intervention between 16th of December and 18th of April, 16th of December 2021 and the 18th of April 2022. So the treatment group consists of households in odd number clusters on the route that get the intervention first. The control group consists of households in the even number clusters on that route and all other routes because they don't receive the intervention first, as well as households in odd number clusters on all other routes until the date that they receive the treatment. So the start of treatment for each route is the staggered over dates, with T0 being the start of the treatment. So we define the pre-treatment period as 3 observation dates before treatment, and then post treatment period as all observation dates after. This is a visualization of the staggered design. So for example, group number 1 gets treated on the 12th of December, and every 3 days another group starts getting treated up to the last week, which is group number 38, which gets treated on the 18th of April. Here we show summary statistics and a simple difference in 2 main outcomes. First, we want to know what is the share of households who segregate if they dispose of waste, and second, what is the share of waste that is segregated, the share of total waste that is being thrown. So for the pre-treatment period, for the observation date -3 to treatment date, we see that the treated and control areas have very similar share of households who segregate. And that in the post-treatment period, the share increases to about 25% for the treated clusters and to about 50% for the control clusters. And the share of waste that is segregated is also very similar before the treatment, about 3.5%, and this increases to 70% in treatment clusters and about 2% in control clusters.
So the treatment is just more signage about what you should be doing in terms of segregating waste. So before the treatment, there was a bin provided with.
Yeah.
But this is just giving more information.
More information and more actual training how to do it inside those. Yeah.
Just a quick one on time. So you showed us the different treatment groups. This is when the people are getting your pamphlets and blanks, right? And then do you see any difference between those who get it early? Like, do they keep complying with it with respect to people who are getting it later, kind of getting up persistence effects?
Yeah, so I will show the event study estimates. Overall, we do see that people keep up the segregation rate over time. Which is quickly about the estimation strategy. Because of the staggered design, we need to implement a staggered difference estimator that takes the design structure into account. Following the recent literature on two-way fixed effects on staggered difference, we adopt the two-stage difference in difference procedure from Gardner. Simply what this procedure does is then in the first stage, regression, orthogonalizes the dependent variable or our outcome of interest with respect to the group and time fixed index. And then on the second stage, it implements an appropriately weighted second stage regression of this orthogonalized regression of the treatment indicator. So the two-stage difference in results suggest that the share of households that segregate increases by about 15 percentage points, and also the share of the segregated waste as a share of total waste also increases by about 14 percentage points. In terms of over time, we look at weeks relative to treatment, or 5 weeks before the treatment, and also up to 10 weeks after the treatment. We see that the share of households that segregate increases and stays pretty high over time, and the same with also the waste segregated as a share of local waste. Overall, overall waste management is an issue in developing countries with severe health, environmental, and financial consequences, and segregation and circular economies are promoted as a key way to improving waste management systems around the world, but there's very limited data that works in developing countries. We implemented doorstepping training in segregation, recycling, and composting in a large urban setting in India to households through a randomized staggered research design. The experimental evidence shows that this training can substantially increase segregation at source. So we saw that with the difference and also with the two-stage difference in the first setting. And what we're working on now is to look at over time, like later, what happens after 10 weeks and as more and more clusters get the treatment, what happens with the segregation rates. But initial findings, we have seen that segregation rates remain high over a long period of time. Other questions?
What was the kind of, was all government instigated? Paying for this?
So people do have to pay for the collection of waste, and then the project was designed together with the government to introduce segregation.
And the government was mainly interested in getting better separation of the
reduce the amount of waste that ends up.
And just going back to Claire's question, was it the case that you had waste on the streets around I mean, the people just, it's often in India that you see waste just left on the street around.
Yeah.
So this wasn't about that. It was like, if you got it in the bin, then separate it better. They weren't trying to clear up the kind of light.
We're not measuring that, but that could be another outcome that potentially could be affected with this, but we have a way of measuring how that changed over time, but that is definitely on.
And are you going to try to quantify any of the kind of emissions reclaim?
Not yet, but eventually when we have final results and results we move on to see what happens with the waste reduction, if there's a reduction in the state.
So that just understand that particularly growth mission, there was almost no separation of waste to begin with. People were just throwing it in either.
Yeah.
Do you think there might be a way to also see that whether this affects what people buy in the first place, that if they know something is recyclable then they have to segregate it, this might also affect their purchasing behavior?
So you're saying that it will affect what they buy, or? Yeah, I get the stakeholder makes sense, but we have not measured that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, it's hard to wrap my head around this because this data seems very promising. But yet when we go around the holes in LSE, or like there's very clear evidence of what should go into each bin, and they're literally placed next to each other. People still like constantly put the wrong things in, right? So it seems like at the very least, information doesn't work in all settings. And I'm just wondering what made it very effective here. Do you have any like survey evidence or even just interviews with people? Like, is there any extra perceived benefit? Because at an individual level, there's an effort cost to separating your waste and actually figuring out what was where. It's true that it's very visual, but you know, you still need 2 bags and a bit of time.
So we did baseline and one survey that we're gonna eventually use to kind of piece out the mechanism, what is happening and look at even homogeneous effects. I think our understanding of it is that once they have people come into their house and spend time with them and teach them how to segregate, maybe that made the difference of rather than just giving a pamphlet or visualizing this is recyclable waste, this is not recyclable waste. So it might be just a personal contact and the attention that was given to the households.
Yeah. So I remember in the deep indeed, there was also when you show the full like the pre-post, there was also a pre-post change in the control group that seemed quite large.
Sorry.
There seemed to be a pre-post change in the control group as well.
That's because all the groups eventually get treatment. So by design, then the last group will have just.
Okay, so the post was a combination of also after they
Yeah.
got treated. Okay.
Do you see evidence of spillovers between, I mean, you know, this sort of information disseminates, can you look at the time to see? Something like that?
Yeah, we need to go look into that. I think based on our design, because the cluster is 100 buildings that are contiguous to each other, and then also the randomization is happening in a way like if you imagine the map to be a chessboard, so every other cluster is being treated. I think that's how we were thinking and thinking with the spillovers, but we should like definitely
And sort of the mechanics of this, such that complementarities are important. I mean, presumably if, you know, if I do my separating and nobody else does, that has a lower effect than if others do, but is there some sort of, it needs a certain share of the waste to be segregated before there's some level of contamination where, you know, the emissions are much worse? Is this sort of a linear thing? Is how important is it to achieve scale? I mean, how do I think about that 25% as opposed to 75% in terms of the emissions policies of it?
Yeah, I think I guess that goes back to eventually calculating what the benefits are in terms of emission. I mean, what makes the difference. I think at this stage, we're just comparing levels of starting with 5% segregation rates to a jump of 20 percentage points. But yeah, we'll have to think about like what makes sort of the segregation rate impact on emissions.
Thank you.